President, I want to be able to address this body. Talk about an issue that we don't talk about enough, deficit. It's an issue for whatever reason we've stopped talking about in Washington, D.C. We're talking about tax policy, as we should. We're talking about disaster relief areas, which we should. We're talking about healthcare policy, which we should. A lot of other things. We've stopped talking about debt and deficit, and I think that's a mistake for us. You see, as the trend has moved since 2011 at a high point when our deficit spending that year was $1.3 trillion in overspending in a single year. Since that point, deficits have gone down a little bit each year until 2015. In 2016, our deficit number, that's a single year overspending, started going back up. It went up in 2016, it went up again in 2017, turning the wrong direction. As you'll recall, and as many people in this body would recall, deficits were a major topic for us starting in 2010. And each year, Congress was trying to find ways to be able to reduce the deficit. It doesn't seem to be the issue anymore. What I bring is a set of solutions and a set of ideas. How do we get out of this? Are there bipartisan solutions to actually deal with deficit overspending? There are priority things that we need to spend money on. We should spend money on those things. But things that are non-essential for us, or things that we would all find some way to agree, hey, there's a better way to be able to spend our dollars, we should. So this week I produced our third annual federal fumble book. We call it 100 Ways the Federal Government Has Dropped the Ball. None of these should be all that controversial, though we won't agree with all of them. But there's simple ways to be able to look at what the federal government is doing, what they're not doing, where we're spending, where we're overspending, and where additional oversight is needed. There's no problem in this country that can't be solved, and certainly our deficit's an issue that can't be solved. It's just going to have a decision made by each of us that this is actually important, and we're going to try to resolve this and try to get us back towards balance. Now, I lump all these issues from this book back into a whole series of different process things, because each one of the 100 things that we identify are not just standalone, they're a part of a bigger problem. So I put them together into budget process reforms, grant process reforms, allowing more transparency into how decisions are made and what decisions have been made. And I would tell you as well, Senate rule changes that are going to be needed to be able to resolve any of these issues. So we put these together in these four big blocks and to be able to say, what are we actually dealing with? Well, let me just give you a couple ideas of things. If we're going to actually deal with some of the budget issues, we're going to have to actually deal with the budget process. We're not going to get a better product until we get a better process. Since 1974, the Budget Act has only worked 4 times. 4 times. And every year the American people say over and over again, what just happened? How come we're back in this budget fight? How come it's at the end of the year? How come this is not resolved? Because we have a bad process is why. Our process is not constitutional. It's a product of the law that was put in the Budget Act. We need to be able to change that. I think there are some basic ways to be able to resolve that. I'd like to do budgeting and appropriations every 2 years. That would give us more time to be able to do more oversight. That gives us more time for floor debate on it to be able to walk through this. There's multiple other areas that need to be resolved, like aligning our committees and other things that need to be done if we're actually going to get budget work done. In the meantime, we need to be able to push through what we can with the greatest efficiency, but long-term, we are going to have to fix a broken process that we have. We should fix the grant-making process. There's been a lot of pressure to be able to move dollars towards grants because now we put more and more restrictions on contracting. So because there's very few restrictions on grants, a lot of agencies are now spending more on grants than they are on contracting. And they're pushing dollars out the door with very little supervision. We've got to work on transparency. I'm ashamed to say, for 6 years, I pushed on a very simple bill called the Taxpayers' Right to Know. It is passed unanimously in the House 2 different years. It comes over to the Senate and it gets tied up. The taxpayer's right to know is very simple. It asks every agency to list everything they do. What a shocking thing that would be, to actually know everything that every agency does. To be able to see what they do, what they spend on it, how many employees they allocate to it, and how many people they serve. Every business in America can give you a list of everything that they do, except for the federal government. We cannot. We should. It would give the opportunity for agency heads to find out before they start a program to know if someone else already does it in the federal government. I've talked to multiple agency individuals now under 2 different presidents that have said they started a program, got it developed, committed people to it, and then a couple of months or years later determined somebody else is already doing it. Even our agency folks don't know what the other agencies are doing. This should be a simple, straightforward solution to be able to help our agencies and to be able to help all of us to be able to do greater supervision over the budget. And the fourth thing is dealing with Senate rule changes. If we don't solve the issue of our nominations, we will never be able to get actual legislation on the floor and get back to debate again. We've stopped debating on major bills. We've stopped debating on small bills because it takes so much time, it's easier just to not do it at all. That's not what the American people sent us here to do. When we say the Senate cannot debate a topic, no one can believe it. That rule doesn't get better based on inactivity. It gets better when we actually fix the basic problem that we have, and that is get us back to debate, solve the nomination process, and let's actually get this resolved. Now, saying all that, all of the things that are in this book this year are things that myself and my staff and my team, and Derek Osborne, who's led all of the compilation of this on my team, have put together this basic package to say, here are 100 items. Quite frankly, I would hope that all 100 senators could go through budget areas and everybody could find 100 items and could identify it and say, let's compare our list then. And say, what are we going to do to be able to deal with debt and deficit? How are we going to deal with some of the spending and inefficiencies of the federal government? We'll probably have 100 different lists, but I bet of the 100 different lists, we'd find a lot of common ground and we'd actually start to solve some things. What type of things did we find on our list this year? Well, let me give you some examples. National Science Foundation did a grant this past year to study the effect and how things are going for refugees in Iceland. Now, I'm sure the country of Iceland would like to know how it's going for their refugees, and maybe even the UN would like to know, but I'm a little stunned that the National Science Foundation used American tax dollars to study refugees in Iceland. National Endowments for the Arts did a grant this past year to help pay for a local community theater in New Hampshire and their performance of Doggy Hamlet. Doggy Hamlet is an outdoor presentation where a group of people are yelling and singing around a group of sheep and sheepdogs in an outdoor performance. Now, I've watched the performance. I look at the performance and think that's fine if the folks of New Hampshire want to do that performance. I'm just not sure why the people of Oklahoma are forced through their federal tax dollars to pay for the production of Doggy Hamlet. The Department of Defense last year moved some equipment into Kuwait to be able to give to the Iraqi army, $1 billion worth of equipment into Kuwait to give to the Iraqi army. Humvees, small arms, mortars, all that's fine as we're helping equip the Iraqi army to help allow them to be able to defend themselves. The problem becomes we lost track of them somewhere between Kuwait and Iraq. And DOD doesn't know what happened to $1 billion of equipment after it was delivered to Kuwait. The IRS has had multiple issues that we tried to identify in different segments of this. One is, several years ago, we noticed that the IRS was rehiring employees that they had fired. Employees that weren't paying their income tax but were working for the IRS, or employees that were using their position to spy on other Americans and pull up their tax information just because of their own interest. Well, it's a fireable offense of the IRS, and it should be, to be able to violate some Americans' privacy. But the problem was the IRS has started rehiring those same people right back. Now, I don't know many companies that fire somebody, then later decide they're going to change their mind and rehire them, but apparently the IRS has become proficient at that. We identified it several years ago. The IRS said they would stop it. We did a check-in on that last year. Guess what? The IRS is still doing it, rehiring employees they'd fired, some of them even with their file stamped, "Do not hire." Hired them anyway. We've got to be able to stop that. The IRS has also did a study through a program that they have to be able to research tax compliance. Not changing tax rules, just how are people complying with the tax rules? And evaluating, are they paying the correct amount of tax? Now, quite frankly, our tax system is so incredibly complicated, it's hard to be able to track what is the right amount. But the IRS should be able to look at that and determine whether someone is paying the right amount based on those figures. The IRS has developed some programs to be able to recommend. The problem is they've not implemented those programs. Over $400 billion of taxes are never collected by the IRS because they're not implementing the recommendations that they have already in front of them. The IRS has also had an issue we're trying to be able to deal with, and along with several other entities, by the way, who's alive and who's not alive. See, the Social Security Administration keeps track of something called the Death Master File. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? The Death Master File. But it basically says who's passed away in America and what Social Security number is not functional anymore. The IRS is not fully implementing that list, and at times is still sending checks to people that died years ago, where some fraudulent person will take a Social Security number from someone who passed away, will file a return on that Social Security number in January or February, and the IRS is sending them a check simply because they're not listing that this person has passed away and that Social Security number is not active. They're not the only one on that. We also identified for the SNAP program, what some people call the food stamp program still, for the SNAP program, there are thousands of retailers that are using these false Social Security numbers from people that have passed away. And last year, over it's $2.6 billion was sent out to SNAP retailers to Social Security numbers of people that have passed away or that are non-operable. Those are things that are fixable. $2.6 billion of just fraud that's in the system. We've asked the question about immigration, and immigration's been an important topic here. We talk about immigration as well, and not just in the financial portion of it, but in the fumble portion of some things that are actually going wrong in immigration currently. Because a lot of folks, and some folks even in this body, have said, if we'll just enforce the law as it exists and build a fence, we'll be fine. The problem is, right at 66% of the people that are in the country illegally came into the country legally with a legal visa, but overstayed the visa. They never left. After 9/11, the 9/11 Commission said one of the major aspects to deal with immigration was to do an entry-exit visa system. So we would know when someone came in, who they were, and we would also know when they left. That was a recommendation from the 9/11 Commission. It's still not been done, a decade and a half later. If we're going to deal with immigration, one of the key things we have to have is not just a wall or a fence or some sort of barrier, but it's also trying to deal with when people come in and when they leave under legal visa systems. I've heard comments about, let's hire more Border Patrol folks and more ICE folks. Okay, fine, I'm good with that actually. Here's the problem. Current system set up, it takes over 450 days to hire one person as a Border Patrol person because the process is so convoluted. 450 days. How'd you like to apply for a job and you wouldn't hear back about it for a year and a half? 450 days. What about if we're going to add more immigration attorneys? We have a 500,000 person backlog in our immigration courts right now. What if we were to hire more judges to be able to handle that process? Great idea. Guess how long it takes to be able to hire more judges in the immigration court? 742 days right now to be able to hire a judge to be able to add to the immigration court. You see, our problems are not just immigration. There's structural problems in the federal government right now, in hiring, in oversight, in managing the reports. I mentioned the IRS not implementing one of the reports that they have. There's also an issue with some other agencies that'll put on the back of the federal vehicles the number, like how's my driving? Here's the phone number to call. What a great idea for a federal vehicle. The problem is when we looked at it, we found out that the agencies never actually read the reports that came in. So if people called in and said, this particular car number is driving crazy, no one's actually looking at it. It's the fear that Americans have of no one's really listening to me in the federal government. Claire McCaskill and I just worked to be able to pass something here in this body to try to deal with how are we going to solve just this basic question. Can agencies ask, how am I doing? When most of us get a rent car or a hotel room online, we'll get an email right after we check out of that room or stop using that rent car saying, how was our service? Is there anything that we can improve? Do you know federal agencies can't do that? Or it's become so complicated that they can't produce a simple 3-question e-survey to be able to send out to people to say, how are we doing in Social Security disability? How are we doing in Veterans Administration? How are we doing in our HUD assistance to you? The reason for that is the Paperwork Reduction Act, of all things. An old law that was supposed to help us is actually in the way of us now in the modern age trying to do basic surveys. We need to be able to resolve that. And that's something this body can lead out to be able to change. There are a lot of things that we want to just be able to identify and to say, we can do better. This is our list. Quite frankly, this is our to-do list for the next year, just like the previous 2 volumes have been. And we've seen some things that we've been able to accomplish over the last couple of years from previous federal fumble books. But you can't get started on them until you actually identify them and say, that's a problem, how are we going to fix it? Our simple question for the rest of this body is, here's our list. What's yours? What are the things that we're working on? What are the things that we're going to actually get done and say that we've solved for the American people? What are the crazy stories and the things that we're wasting money on that if we only identified it and said, let's stop that, we could and would? Let's do it together. There's no reason reducing the deficit should have to be an issue that's become a partisan issue. Deficit and growing debt affects every single American. So let's work on it together. And let's stop finding ways that we don't work on it and find areas of common ground where we can work on it. Let's fix inefficiencies in federal government hiring. Let's fix inefficiencies in our system. We have a tremendous number of great federal employees that are all around the country that work extremely hard for the American people every day and do great work, but are trapped in a system that slows them down, that prevents them from being as efficient as they'd like to be. Let's help them out by fixing the broken things that are in these agencies and systems. Let's set them free to be able to actually serve people the way that they want to be able to serve people. There are things that we can do. Let's get busy doing it. If you're interested in knowing more about the federal fumbles, just go to our website, lankford.senate.gov. The whole list is there. For any office that's here, we'll send you a copy over. Better yet, we'll just send you a link to our website because it's even cheaper and you don't have to print it off there and you can look at it online. The issue of the day for us is, let's find what your list is. We've started ours. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.